It's October the 4th, 2023. This is 508, a show about Worcester. Here we are in downtown Worcester with Brendan Milliken.
What a beautiful day it is today, Mike.
It is. This weather is amazing. This is this sort of weird 2-day, 80-degree high thing that we get here in the beginning of October.
I will take it.
Brendan, I want to talk about voting in the city of Worcester, and especially strategic voting in the city of Worcester.
You were
gonna comment on something.
What was that?
About elections. The thing about elections is...
Oh, well, no, I think that one of the things that's interesting about elections nationwide, so not Worcester specific, but that's important for people to keep in mind, especially in contentious elections, is that, so you go back 10, 15 years, it was over 50% of Americans, like, kind of played the game that historically political parties have played, that like they're not really trying to like move further and further apart. They keep a degree of consensus by allowing people to kind of hop from one party to the other based on who is the most attractive candidate at that moment in time. And as a result, most Americans viewed both parties as trustworthy and honest and what have you. Now we're down to below, last time I looked, it was well below 30% of Americans believe both parties have the nation's interests at heart, believe that they're trustworthy, and believe they're made up of good people. So I think one of the problems that we're going to start running into when we're looking at, and that's why this came up before we started talking, when it comes to looking at historical data, one of the problems that we're going to start running into is you have to figure out how to figure in that people are locked into a party, right? Like the likelihood of somebody jumping ship from one party to another now it's almost mathematically impossible. Something really, really wacky would happen for somebody to do that. And it's more likely that someone is likely to accept a subpar candidate of their own party. And again, respecting that, no, we don't do parties in Worcester technically. They're more likely to hold their nose, bite their tongue, whatever, a candidate they consider subpar in their own party than ever dream of voting for the other party, or blank out ballots, as the case may be. And the only reason I was bringing it up is you wanted to talk elections today, which I'm thrilled about because you're better at that than I am. But the one thing that I think we're finding more and more is that you can almost predict, if you can figure out that math, who's assigned to what group or body. All that's left over are the swing voters, like the people that are literally making up their minds when it comes to voting as they're walking into polling places, which I feel like you and I have laughed at this very concept for as long as we've known each other now, but that really is voting now, is like the majority of people, you know where they were going to be 4 years ago, probably 10 years ago. Then there's that around 10% of the population that has no idea where they're going to be when they walk into the polling place. They're either going to see a name or something's going to register with them, or they saw an advertisement the night before, and that's the thing that makes up their mind for them.
Yeah.
That's really all I had for you.
Well, I want to talk about strategic voting in Worcester elections. You know, Brendan, you could vote your preference when you go in to vote, which is straightforward and pretty easy to do, or you could try to vote strategically. I think it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do, what your goals are.
If you have money on the race.
If you have money, yeah, and you know, and we can point out that like, obviously your vote doesn't count. Like there's no election in Worcester that's like an exact tie.
Right.
Like sometimes elections come pretty close and there's a recount because of that.
Yeah.
But we're never like one vote away from a recount. That's crazy. So
I think precincts, we came kind of close in this most recent preliminary. There were a couple precincts, I believe in 2 and in 1, that they were like really neck and neck. But yeah, to your point, once you actually start stacking all it, there's too many people here.
But you know, we could say like at the same time, like obviously like a voting block of 10 people or 20 people or 100 people or 1,000 people is certainly impactful on the election.
Huge.
And you're probably a member of some kind of voting block, whether explicit or implicit.
Sure.
And so there may be many people in the city where you have made an implied promise to vote. So, you know, people always say like, well, okay, fine, like my vote doesn't matter, but what if I organize 100 people? Does that matter? And it's like that potentially does matter. And also, if you organize 100 people, those 99 people should vote, and you should not vote.
Right.
But except that you have an implied promise to all of them, like I will also vote, I will stay in your block. Anyway, so you could vote your preference, vote for who you like, or you could try to vote strategically. You know, I think in some ways it probably depends on like how much emotion comes into it. Like. Obviously, since your vote probably doesn't matter, voting your heart probably makes a lot of sense a lot of the time. In which case, like in the Worcester at-large elections, the city council, the school committee, you're voting, you know, you're writing 6 people's names down on your ballot. You're voting 6 times, and overall, the top 6 vote getters get elected. And this time we have what, like 11 people running for city council, and so you could certainly just like be like, these are my 6 favorite people. In which case, thanks for watching 508. I've been Mike Benedetti. This has been Brendan Milliken. We appreciate your time as always. Or you could try to vote strategically. And again, if voting doesn't matter, the strategic voting definitely doesn't matter. But the reality is that I think a lot of us get in the polling booth, or before we go down to vote, we're thinking, should I leave blank slots on my ballot?
Right.
Should I do this? We spend some amount of effort every 2 years thinking about this stuff. And so that's where, for me, there's some value in trying to drill down on it mathematically and say, okay, fine. I'm thinking about this in the same way that I'm like carving a little owl out of wood, right? Like, is it, you know, am I going to sell that owl for enough money to make it worth my time? No, but it's a reasonable use of time. It feels worthwhile to me. In the same way,
it feels. Do on a Thursday.
What else are you going to be doing? It feels worthwhile. So, if you're going to vote strategically, Greg Opperman and I have done some of the math around trying to figure out Worcester elections, like these pick 6 elections in general, and the 2023 city council at-large election in particular. Here's the summary. Maybe I'll tell you the summary, and then maybe we can talk about how I get to the summary, or how we got to these summaries, and we can talk about your objections. Because I'll say this, just because I'm like bringing math into this, people, don't believe me. Like, if you have objections, tell me your objections. I mean, this math is not super solid.
Like, were you good at math?
I was great at math.
Okay, I'm taking your word for it.
I know.
Calculus. I'm back in college and I'm taking remedial math right now. They changed it all.
Well, I did combinatorics as part of this thing today. There's a lot of statistical stuff we're doing today. We're using the Monte Carlo method, I would say, a lot today. This is what it's called. This is what it's called. Here's what you should do if you want to vote strategically in a Worcester Pick 6 election. You shouldn't vote for anyone who's guaranteed to win or to lose. Leaving ballot slots blank does slightly help the candidates that you do vote for, but the effect is extremely slight. So if there are 6 plausible candidates you like or that you don't hate, you should vote 6 times. That's the summary. Again, thanks for watching 508.
Well, thanks for coming.
So
what were your takeaways from that thesis?
Well, I'll tell you that. Maybe I'll tell you the. I kind of want to leave the good part to the end, but I don't know if that's how people watch a podcast. Like the piece that I really looked into and did some math on was the piece trying to figure out, does it make sense to bullet vote? Like, if you have 6 slots on your ballot and you only fill one of those slots with candidate A, let's say, you know, with Gary Rosen, let's say, does that help Gary Rosen more than if you voted for Gary Rosen and 5 other candidates in the election? Or does voting for those 5 other candidates, because there's some situations in which there would have been a tie and you would have broken the tie, but now you're not breaking the tie because you're also voting for Bill Coleman or whatever, and now Bill Coleman is going to win, that there are these crazy marginal cases.
You just helped me realize that Worcester, in effect, has a really bizarre, modified form of ranked choice voting without intending to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that it has exactly what it intends to have.
Yeah, no, but it's like the idea behind ranked choice. I mean, just in theory, that you're voting for this block of people.
Yeah.
Nobody's really that passionate by an entire voting block of people. They can't be.
Okay.
If they are,
some people are. I mean, we can get into that. That's a separate question that I feel like we could talk about more in another show. I feel like I bring some evidence on that. So anyway, so just looking at bullet voting, what I did was I made like a theoretical computer model of an election with 12 candidates running for 6 seats. Statistically, we'd call that 12 choose 6. Yep. Or combinatorically, we'd call it 12 choose 6. And said, what if all the voters just vote randomly? You know, but you don't vote randomly, you vote strategically. When should you, you know, how, you know, if you bullet voting, how does that look versus you not bullet voting? And what I found was that you're like 80% more like it like adds like another 0.8 of a vote, kind of. So if you're voting for Gary Rosen, only for Gary Rosen, you're kind of voting for Gary Rosen 1.8 times versus if you voted for all 6 people, in which case you'd only be voting for Gary Rosen once. But you'd also be voting for Bill Coleman one time. You'd also be voting for, you know, all kinds of people one time. Yeah. So as you can tell, I can only think of Gary Rosen and Bill Coleman. They're the only people in my heart.
This is how Mike Bullitt votes.
So this is based on like a totally fake computer model where people vote randomly for 12 candidates,
right.
which is crazy. In reality, it's a lot less than 0.8. It's way less than 0.8. And so this is where I think we get the idea that even if it was 0.8, you should almost certainly vote for 2 people. If there's somebody who you like 80% as much as Gary Rosen, you should be voting for them as well. And because, you know, 1 vote for Gary and 1 vote for another person is going to be better for you than 1.8 votes for Gary, I think. Am I doing the math right? And probably there's multiple people you should be voting for.
Yeah.
That's where that comes from. So basically, bullet vote if you want to, and it is going to help your guy, but it's not going to help your guy much.
Yeah.
You know, again, it's not going to help your guy to vote for them at all to begin with. But, you know, we're looking at it strategically. The other thing was that Greg looked at the number of votes that candidates got in past elections. Because we have a lot of people who are running this year who've run at least once in the past, if not a lot of times in the past. Bill Coleman actually is since 1987 is one of the top, I want to say top 5, definitely top 10 in terms of number of years he's run for an office.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, Joe Petty as well. He's been in office since what, 98?
Joe Petty's also way up there, yeah. So for some of these people, we got a lot of evidence, and what Greg found was that looking at just the last 5 elections, people get a reasonably consistent number of votes year to year. There's obviously a lot of ups and downs, but it's within a fairly narrow range. I don't think he looked beyond before the last 5 elections, because you're kind of trying to figure out like what's really relevant to this year. And he did a little bit of a time weighting thing where the election 5 years ago is going to be less important for his average than the election 5 cycles ago, less important than 4 cycles ago, 3 cycles ago, 2 cycles ago, last cycle.
Yes.
At the same time, this is totally ignoring anything involving 2023, right? Like,
well, that's a big thing too, because I mean, if you look at if you were to jump back another 10 years from where you did, you're in a completely different time politically, right? I mean,
it's night and day. And
you're going from what you folks looked at is the start of the Tea Party movement to now, which on its outset, I think was far more popular and viewed far less suspiciously as it is historically today, and what it's become currently is viewed as today. It's but a lot of those people that you're talking about, some of our longest standing councilors, that wave is what got them on the council in the first place.
There you go. Well, whenever he's looking at a time-weighted average of like the last 5 elections or however many elections people ran, and then you're kind of looking at like what is that like election to election variance look like, and we'll take this into account, and we'll say we'll simulate some computer elections based on the idea that Joe Petty gets probably this number of votes on average, but there's also going to be some variance, so depending on where we're gonna throw in some random factors to account for that. What Greg found is that when he ran 1 million simulations of a 2023 election, that Petty won in 1 million of those simulations.
Interesting.
And initially, he only did like 1 standard deviation of spread, in which case not only Petty but like King and Toomey, all these people were a total 100% lock, or 99.999% lock. So he did 2 standard deviations, being like, now we're going to consider some pretty crazy scenarios, but now still 99% of all possible elections are going to be within 2 standard deviations, probably.
Interesting.
And so he did this in part because you don't want to just be like everybody's a lock. You kind of want to think about like, well, maybe some people are more of a lock than others. Right. And in this case, he found that Petty is basically still a sure thing.
Yes.
That Toomey, King, and Bergman all won in 95% plus of those scenarios in there. So that doesn't mean that they're a total lock, but it means they're pretty close to a lock, especially with 2 standard deviations. Tu Nguyen was 86%, and one reason that I think that they did worse in his model that you might think based on their vote count was just we only have 1 data point for them. So you got to kind of say like, what's their consistency year to year? We have no idea. We can make some reasonable guesses about that, but they're not going to look. It's going to give them. There's going to be more uncertainty there. And then Calorio, 79%. 79% with more elections than 2. So a legit like significantly less of a chance than the other candidates based on the last 5 elections. Everyone will be sad to know that Coleman and Kramer each have a 2 to 4% chance of winning. That's in the two standard deviation model. In one standard deviation model, there's no chance that they win.
Interesting.
Right, which again, I would have thought that Kramer had a higher chance than that. I would have thought Bill Coleman honestly had a lower chance than that, because Worcester doesn't know what's good for them and is never going to vote Bill Coleman for anything. Not in this reality. You know what I say, Brendan? A, B, C. A always, B, C. Voting for Coleman. Always be Coleman. And then the other people who are on the ballot, who are Morales, Peroni, and Hampton Dance, are like, who the heck knows, right? And so Greg's big takeaway is that you shouldn't vote for Coleman and Kramer because they're just not gonna. There's no. You're throwing your vote away. There's no way they're gonna win. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't vote for Petty, Toomey, King, and Bergman because they're all gonna win whether you want them to or not.
Right.
So you should be thinking about Nguyen, Colorio, Morales, Perron, or Hampton Dance, and saying if any of those you like, put them on your ballot. And you could leave the rest of the slots blank if you want, give them maybe a little minuscule amount of extra oomph, or you could throw some other people on there, that's fine too. But those would be the people that you should really think about, do I want these people elected or not? That if there's any chance of your vote mattering in this, you know, fantasy football version of voting we're doing here,
yeah,
that's what you gotta do. Now, I don't know if this makes sense, you know, how do you think that this model based on the last 5 elections stacks up to your sense of the actual real world 2023?
Well, I think it stacks just fine, but very neatly, like everything in Worcester. But it's also based just on past outcomes of past elections, without taking into account. This is actually kind of an interesting, not just local election cycle, but an interesting political cycle for that local election cycle to be in on. Like, none of those past 5 elections were abortion rights on the table nationally, and in conjunction with none of those 5 cycles where abortion rights weren't on the table. Nationally, because that's probably the biggest conversation taking place affecting national politics. But now we've brought it back to the local level by spending over the last year discussing it on a local level in a way that I think is just confusing enough, where the council has kind of self-identified as folks that are not willing to go the distance in terms of protecting abortion rights versus being wishy-washy on it, which is something that is new around here, but it also harkens back to an older time with older Irish politicians, Irish and Italian politicians, mostly Catholics in Worcester, going back to the original Roe era, where you saw them get wiped out in many cases because they found themselves on the wrong team almost overnight as the political tone of the country changed. And like, that's something that I don't even know how you'd begin to account for that with a you know, math like you're doing now. Would probably have to call in the 538 people to help out on that one. I mean, that's a lot of polling is going to go into that there.
I mean, I think the 538 people would say, like, that's the thing, is we don't have any reliable public polling of Worcester, which is why the last reliable public poll we have of Worcester is like the 2021 election. So this is why we're going with that. But again, it's a pretty bad it's a pretty bad data point for 2023.
I think it's a great. Hey, speaking of people to vote for, future Mayor Christian King right there.
There he is. He didn't hear you.
May have.
Oh, I thought his shirt says Bermuda. I thought it said Bergman for a second. I'm kind of disappointed. Anyway.
That would be awesome in a weird way. I think that's the problem, is like there are a lot of things at play in Worcester that reflect things that are in play nationally. Going into a presidential cycle is the wrong time to ever be on the wrong side of any of those issues, even if it's the side that you've always been on, especially if you've never really had to be vocal and articulate where you stand on any one of those issues. And it's not just that one with crisis pregnancy centers or whatever the case may be. We've had a lot of conversations about the role of law enforcement in Worcester, and we've seen people carve out territory where they actually fall. That has happened in the past in Worcester. We're no stranger to that. But it really hasn't happened at the same moment in time that the national conversation is taking on a life of its own. And things are starting to happen nationally that impact policy on a state and local level. So I just to keep it relatively brief, I think that's fantastic. I see no fault in anything that you stated, other than when you throw in the curveball of reality. Like today's reality, which is where it gets problematic. I agree, like, the four people you mentioned, who I think you mentioned are shoo-ins mathematically, I agree completely, but I don't think it takes into account the mayor's race, which, like, again, Joe will probably be on the. I would be shocked if Joe Petty wasn't on the council going into next year. I would be equally shocked if he was mayor.
Really?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay.
No, I would be upset with myself and my own ability to reason. I think, again, we have a Senate race to look at where a relatively unknown, part of the program, so to speak, but relatively unknown young woman throttled Joe Petty in his own city,
true.
like to an embarrassing level. Like, that's the sort of thing that you get throttled like that when you have a massive scandal behind you, not when somebody who nobody's ever met or heard of before, when it comes to regular voters, is given a choice, destroys you.
And I feel like Joe Petty's entire running for that race was completely against his brand. And we've complained on here, we talked here before about like Bob Dole when he ran for president, that Bob Dole was always like the hilariously mean dude in the Senate. And then when he ran for president, he's like, I'm warm, cuddly Grandpa Bob Dole. So nobody wants to vote for you. And also nobody wants to vote for you afterwards because they're like, who are you, Bob Dole? Well, and a similar thing with Joe Petty. It's like, he didn't run for state senate as the quiet man. He didn't run for state senate as somebody who didn't care that much if he got it. He ran for somebody who really wanted it. That's not the Joe Petty brand. The Joe Petty brand is, I was there, therefore
what else were you going to vote for?
Right. I'm like, I Forrest Gumped my way into being the mayor, and I guess this is fine.
But this is, and you just mentioned something, I think inadvertently, another factor that I think comes into play here as well. I mean, the biggest conversation happening about our presidential cycle right now, because there aren't really any issues to discuss per se, being too far out, is age. And, we have a count. So, Mike, our camera died twice in the short period of time there, so I'm going to try and make this quick and get back to where I was. But the other demographics that we have to take into consideration are age, which is being discussed, a huge factor in the presidential cycle. Of course, none of these folks are as old as Joe Biden or Donald Trump, but you mentioned how long they've been here, and I think that's something that does need to be taken into consideration when we have lots of shifts in demographics as we do now.
Yeah.
We've got 25,000 new residents in Worcester, 30,000 probably at this point. Those are the people, you said earlier, that are the ones that are, you tell them that, like, oh, this is what our trash program looks like? Like, yeah, it's crazy. And like, how long has this been? Like, you tell them it's been here for 30 years. Like, what the hell's wrong with you people, right? Like, but those are also the people who are looking at these, well, wait, it's taking these people 30 years to get a trash bag right, garbage collection we can't get right. Our streets are worse than I think they've ever been even the basic stuff, right? Like, it's fun to say things like Rome wasn't built in a day, but I think ultimately the point is that they kind of got it done eventually.
Made some progress. They made some progress year to year.
And that's why I think your math, in closing, is spot on. But I think it does not do a fair job of taking into consideration that there is a lot more in the air in Worcester than we would normally see in early October leading into an election cycle.
Terrific. Well,
that's my take.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you also for watching at home. We'll do some other shows coming up here about the election, probably graph-based episodes rather than political-based episodes. Hope everybody's doing good. This is Mike Bandetti. This is Brendan.
Great seeing y'all.
This is the beautiful city of Worcester. We'll see you later.